Behind the golden gates of Buckingham Palace, where every smile is practiced and every gesture carefully measured, a storm was brewing that would shake the very foundation of the British monarchy. What started as whispered conversations in palace corridors would soon explode into a family crisis that even centuries of royal protocol couldn't contain. King Charles III, the man who had waited over 7 decades to wear the crown, was about to face the most difficult decision of his reign. It wasn't about matters of state or international diplomacy. It was about family, loyalty, and the woman he loved more than the crown itself. Camilla, his beloved queen consort, was about to discover that even royal love has its limits when family honor hangs in the balance. The tears that would fall in the private chambers of Windsor Castle that autumn evening weren't just drops of sadness. They were the crystallization of years of hidden tensions, buried secrets, and impossible choices that had been building like pressure in a royal kettle, waiting for the moment when everything would finally boil over. This is the story of how a king chose duty over devotion, how family bonds were tested beyond their breaking point, and how the most private moments of the royal family became their most defining. It's a tale that proves that even those born to rule are not immune to the heartbreak that comes with impossible decisions. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood at his study window, watching the gardeners tend to the rose garden that had been his mother's pride and joy. The weight of the crown, both literal and metaphorical, had settled on his shoulders with a heaviness he hadn't anticipated. 6 months into his reign, he was still adjusting to the reality that every decision he made would be scrutinized, analyzed, and judged by millions around the world. Camilla entered the room quietly, carrying his morning tea on a silver tray. Even as queen consort, she maintained the small, intimate gestures that had defined their relationship for decades. She set the tray down on his mahogany desk, the same desk where his mother had signed countless documents of state, and wrapped her arms around his waist from behind. "You're up early again," she murmured against his shoulder. "The kingdom won't collapse if you sleep past 6 o'clock, darling." Charles turned in her embrace, studying the face that had brought him comfort through decades of public scrutiny and personal turmoil. At 76, Camilla still possessed the warmth and humor that had first captured his heart all those years ago. Her silver hair was styled impeccably, as always, but he could see the tiredness in her eyes that came with the constant pressure of royal duties. "Old habits," he replied, kissing her forehead gently. "Besides, I rather enjoy these quiet moments before the world demands our attention." Their peaceful morning was interrupted by a sharp knock on the study door. Sir Edward Pemberton, Charles's private secretary, entered with the measured urgency that palace staff had perfected over generations of service. "Your Majesty," Sir Edward began, his usually composed demeanor showing slight cracks. "I'm afraid we have a rather delicate situation that requires your immediate attention." Charles raised an eyebrow. In his experience, when palace staff described something as delicate, it usually meant potentially catastrophic. "What sort of situation, Edward?" "It concerns the Queen Consort's nephew, Thomas Parker Bowles," Sir Edward continued, glancing briefly at Camilla, whose face had already begun to pale. "He's been arrested in connection with a rather serious financial scandal. The press hasn't gotten wind of it yet, but it's only a matter of time." Camilla's hand flew to her throat, a gesture Charles recognized from their early days together when she would become overwhelmed by the intensity of public attention. "What kind of financial scandal?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sir Edward cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Money laundering, Your Majesty, through several offshore companies. The amounts are quite substantial, and there's evidence suggesting the activities have been ongoing for several years." The silence that followed was deafening. Charles could feel the weight of the implications settling around them like a heavy blanket. Thomas Parker Bowles wasn't just any distant relative. He was the son of Camilla's brother, a young man who had grown up knowing that his aunt would one day be queen. More importantly, he had been a frequent guest at royal functions, photographed at family gatherings, and had even accompanied them on certain state visits in an unofficial capacity. "How substantial are we talking about?" Charles asked, his voice taking on the measured tone he had learned to use when dealing with potential crises. "Conservative estimates suggest around £12 million, Sir Edward replied. "But the investigation is ongoing, and the figure could climb higher." Camilla sank into one of the leather armchairs that flanked Charles's desk, her composure finally cracking. "This can't be happening," she whispered. "Thomas is just a boy. He's only 28. Surely there's been some mistake." Charles moved to her side, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder, but his mind was already racing through the potential consequences. The monarchy had survived many scandals throughout its long history, but they had always been particularly vulnerable when it came to matters involving money and corruption. The British public, already skeptical about the cost of maintaining the royal family, would not look kindly on any suggestion that royal connections were being used for illegal financial gain. "What's the timeline on this?" Charles asked Sir Edward. "When will charges be formally filed?" "The Crown Prosecution Service is moving quickly," Sir Edward replied. "We're looking at formal charges within the next 48 hours. The story will likely break in the tabloids by tomorrow evening, possibly sooner." Charles began pacing, a habit he had developed during stressful moments throughout his life. The study, with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and portraits of his ancestors, suddenly felt claustrophobic. Every painting seemed to be watching him, judging his response to this crisis that threatened to tarnish the carefully maintained image of the modern monarchy. "Have we spoken to Thomas?" Camilla asked, her voice stronger now, but still trembling with emotion. "Perhaps there's an explanation. Perhaps he's been set up, or he didn't understand the implications of his actions." Sir Edward shifted uncomfortably. "I'm afraid the evidence is quite damning, Your Majesty. Bank records, email correspondence, witness testimony from several co-conspirators who have agreed to cooperate with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences." The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in for all of them. This wasn't a case of youthful indiscretion or poor judgment. This was systematic, deliberate criminal activity that had been carefully planned and executed over an extended period. The connection to the royal family, however distant, would be exploited by every Republican organization and scandal-hungry tabloid in the country. "What are our options?" Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Sir Edward consulted his tablet, scrolling through what appeared to be a detailed crisis management plan that the palace communications team had clearly been working on since the early hours of the morning. "We can issue a statement distancing the royal family from Mr. Parker Bowles and his actions. We can emphasize that he has no official role within the royal household, and that his actions are entirely his own responsibility." "That sounds terribly cold," Camilla interjected. "He's family, Charles. He's my nephew. I can't just abandon him when he's facing the worst crisis of his life." Charles felt the familiar tension that came with balancing personal feelings against royal duty. Throughout his life, he had been forced to make choices that prioritized the institution over individual relationships. His relationship with his own sons had suffered during his divorce from Diana. His marriage to Camilla had been delayed for years because of public opinion and royal protocol. Now, once again, he was being asked to choose between his heart and his crown. "The palace lawyers are also recommending a more comprehensive approach," Sir Edward continued. "They believe we should consider temporarily suspending all family members with connections to Mr. Parker Bowles from any official royal functions or events until this matter is resolved." Camilla looked up sharply. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means your immediate family, Your Majesty, your children, your siblings, anyone who might be photographed or interviewed and asked about Thomas's activities. The legal team believes it's the safest approach to prevent any suggestion of royal endorsement or protection." The implication hung in the air like a storm cloud. Charles could see the pain in Camilla's eyes as she processed what was being suggested. Her family, the people who had supported her through decades of public scrutiny and criticism, were being asked to step away from her during one of the most challenging periods of her life. "For how long?" she asked quietly. "Until the legal proceedings are concluded," Sir Edward replied, "which could be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years, depending on whether Mr. Parker Bowles chooses to fight the charges or accept a plea agreement." Charles resumed his pacing, his mind working through the political implications. The new Labour government was already pushing for greater transparency in royal finances and had been making subtle suggestions about reducing the size of the working royal family. A scandal like this would give them the ammunition they needed to push through more aggressive reforms. The monarchy's carefully negotiated financial arrangements with Parliament could be in jeopardy. "There's one more thing," Sir Edward said hesitantly. "The investigators have indicated that they may want to interview family members who have had recent contact with Mr. Parker Bowles. As a matter of routine, you understand, to establish the extent of their knowledge regarding his business activities." Camilla's face went white. "Are you saying they want to interview me? That they think I might have known about this?" "It's standard procedure in cases like this," Sir Edward assured her. "But the optics would be challenging. A sitting queen consort being questioned by police in connection with a money laundering investigation, even as a witness, would be unprecedented in modern times. Charles stopped pacing and turned to face his private secretary. What does the Lord Chamberlain recommend? Lord Pembroke believes we need to take the most aggressive defensive position possible, Sir Edward replied. Complete separation from Mr. Parker Bowles and anyone connected to him. A clear, unambiguous statement that the royal family had no knowledge of his activities and no involvement in his business affairs. And if that means cutting off Camilla's family entirely? Charles asked. Sir Edward met his gaze steadily. If that's what it takes to protect the monarchy, then, yes, that's what Lord Pembroke recommends. Camilla stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished wood floor. I need some air, she said, her voice thick with emotion. This is all happening too fast. I need time to think. She walked toward the door, then paused and turned back. Charles, whatever you decide, please remember that these people aren't just political liabilities. They're my family. They've stood by me through everything. The divorce, the years of public hatred, the criticism, the death threats. They celebrated with me when we finally got married, and they've supported me every step of the way as I've tried to fulfill my duties as your wife. With that, she left the room, leaving Charles alone with Sir Edward and the weight of an impossible decision. Through the window, he could see Camilla walking quickly across the courtyard, her normally perfect posture slightly hunched as if she were carrying a heavy burden. Sir Edward said quietly, I know this is difficult, but we need a decision quickly. Every hour we delay increases the risk of the story breaking before we can get ahead of it with our own narrative. Charles moved to his desk and picked up a framed photograph of Camilla laughing at some long-forgotten joke during their honeymoon. Her eyes were crinkled with joy, her face radiant with happiness. It had been taken during one of the few moments in their relationship when they had been completely free from public scrutiny and royal obligations. How long have you worked for the royal family, Edward? Charles asked. 32 years, sir. I started as a junior clerk under your mother's private secretary. Then, you understand better than most that sometimes being royal means making choices that break your heart in service of something larger than yourself. Sir Edward nodded solemnly. Indeed, sir. Charles set the photograph down and turned to face the window again. In the distance, he could see Camilla sitting on a bench in the garden, her shoulders shaking slightly in a way that told him she was crying. After everything they had endured together, after all the years of waiting and fighting for their right to be together, they were once again being torn apart by forces beyond their control. Schedule a meeting with the Lord Chamberlain and the Attorney General for this afternoon, Charles said finally. I want to understand all our legal options before we make any decisions. Of course, sir. And what should I tell the press office about preparing a statement? Charles was quiet for a long moment, watching his wife struggle with emotions she couldn't show to the world. Tell them to prepare for all contingencies, he said. But don't release anything until I give the word. As Sir Edward left the room, Charles remained at the window, torn between his duties as a king and his love for the woman who had stood by his side through decades of controversy. The decision he would make in the coming hours would define not just his reign, but the future of their marriage and Camilla's relationship with her family. The crown had never felt heavier than it did in that moment, as he watched the woman he loved suffer alone in the garden below. The private dining room at Clarence House had witnessed countless family gatherings over the years, but none quite like the one that was about to unfold. Charles had chosen this venue deliberately. It was Camilla's former home, the place where she felt most comfortable and secure. If he was going to deliver potentially devastating news to her family, he wanted to do it somewhere that felt safe for everyone involved. Camilla sat at the head of the mahogany table, her hands folded tightly in her lap as family members filed into the room. Her daughter Laura Lopez arrived first, elegant in a navy dress that barely concealed her obvious anxiety. Her son Tom Parker Bowles followed, his usually jovial demeanor replaced by a grim expression that suggested he already suspected why they had been summoned. Camilla's sister Annabel Elliot entered with her husband Simon, both looking puzzled by the urgent nature of the invitation. The last to arrive was Camilla's brother Mark Shand, Thomas's father, whose face bore the telltale signs of a man who had spent the previous night wrestling with impossible thoughts. His usually pristine appearance was slightly disheveled, and Camilla noticed immediately that his hands were trembling slightly as he took his seat. Charles entered the room with the bearing of a man carrying the weight of centuries of royal tradition on his shoulders. He had changed from his morning casual wear into a formal suit, a deliberate choice that signaled this was not a family chat, but a matter of state importance. The transformation was subtle but significant. He was no longer simply Charles, Camilla's husband, but King Charles III, defender of the realm and protector of the institution of monarchy. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," Charles began, his voice carrying the measured cadence he had perfected over decades of public speaking. "I'm afraid we have a situation that affects not just our family, but potentially the stability of the crown itself." The silence that followed was heavy with anticipation. Laura reached for her mother's hand under the table, while Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Annabelle and Simon exchanged worried glances, and Mark stared fixedly at the polished surface of the table. "This morning, I was informed that Thomas has been arrested in connection with a money laundering investigation," Charles continued. "The charges are serious, the evidence appears to be substantial, and the potential impact on the royal family could be catastrophic." Mark's composure cracked instantly. "There has to be some mistake," he said, his voice rising with a mixture of anger and desperation. "Thomas is a good boy. He works in finance, yes, but he's not a criminal. He wouldn't do something like this." Charles looked at his brother-in-law with sympathy. He had been in similar positions of denial throughout his own life, defending family members whose actions had threatened the monarchy. "I'm afraid the evidence suggests otherwise, Mark. The investigation has been ongoing for months. They have bank records, email correspondence, witness testimony from co-conspirators." Camilla finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. £12 million, she said, as if saying the number aloud would make it less real. "They think he's stolen £12 million. The number hit the family like a physical blow. Laura gasped audibly, her hand flying to cover her mouth. Tom leaned back in his chair, his face pale with shock. Annabelle began to cry quietly, while Simon put his arm around his wife's shoulders. "This can't be happening," Mark said, shaking his head repeatedly. "There has to be an explanation. Maybe he was set up, maybe someone else was using his accounts, maybe—" "Mark," Charles interrupted gently but firmly. "I understand your need to find an alternative explanation, but we have to deal with the reality of the situation. The investigation is thorough, the evidence is compelling, and charges will be filed within the next 24 hours. Tom leaned forward, his journalist's instincts kicking in despite his emotional turmoil. "What does this mean for the family? What are the palace lawyers saying?" Charles glanced at Camilla, who was staring out the window at the garden where she had spent so many peaceful hours over the years. "That's what we need to discuss," he said carefully. "The legal and political implications are complex, but the bottom line is that the monarchy cannot be seen as complicit in or protective of criminal activity." "Meaning what exactly?" Laura asked, her voice sharp with defensive anger. "Meaning," Charles said, taking a deep breath, "that the palace legal team is recommending we distance ourselves completely from Thomas and anyone closely connected to him until this matter is resolved." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Mark stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You're talking about cutting off my son, about abandoning him when he needs family support the most. I'm talking about protecting an institution that has survived for over 1,000 years, Charles replied, his tone becoming more formal. "The monarchy serves the people of Britain and the Commonwealth. Our personal feelings, as difficult as this is to accept, must sometimes be secondary to that responsibility." Camilla looked up at her husband, and, for the first time since he had known her, Charles saw something approaching hatred in her eyes. "Secondary to that responsibility," she repeated slowly. "Is that what I am to you? Secondary?" The question cut through him like a blade. "That's not what I said, and you know that's not what I meant, isn't it?" Camilla stood up, her composure finally breaking completely. "Isn't this exactly what I've been to you throughout our entire relationship? Something to be managed, something to be hidden, something to be sacrificed whenever duty calls." The family watched in uncomfortable silence as decades of suppressed resentment poured out of the usually composed queen consort. Laura and Tom had never seen their mother like this, vulnerable, angry, and seemingly on the verge of a complete breakdown. "When we couldn't marry because of public opinion, I was secondary," Camilla continued, her voice rising. "When Diana died, and you had to manage the public relations disaster, I was secondary. When your mother disapproved of our relationship for years, I was secondary. And now, when my family needs support, I'm secondary again." Charles felt the weight of every decision he had made throughout their relationship crashing down on him. She wasn't wrong. He had asked her to sacrifice again and again, always with the promise that someday, when the time was right, they would be able to put their relationship first. But that someday had never really come. "Camilla, please," he said quietly. "This isn't about you personally. This is about protecting something larger than any individual, including myself. Don't you dare lecture me about sacrifice for the monarchy," she shot back. "I've given up 40 years of my life to this institution. I've endured death threats, public humiliation, constant criticism, and the hatred of millions of people. I've watched my children grow up under a microscope, and I've seen my family scrutinized and judged for everything they do. And for what? So that when they finally need support, we can throw them away like they never mattered." Mark stepped closer to his sister, his own anger now matching hers. "Charles, with all due respect, you're asking us to abandon a 28-year-old young man who grew up believing he was part of this family. Thomas has been to every family celebration, every royal wedding, every Christmas gathering. He's been photographed with you, traveled with you, been introduced to heads of state as Camilla's nephew. And now you want to pretend he never existed?" Charles felt the familiar sensation of being pulled in multiple directions by competing loyalties and responsibilities. He looked around the table at faces that had become familiar and dear to him over the years. These weren't just political complications. They were people he cared about, people who had welcomed him into their family when much of the world was still skeptical about his relationship with Camilla. "I want to support Thomas," he said finally. "I want to support all of you. But I also have to consider the broader implications. If we're seen as protecting or enabling criminal behavior, it could trigger a constitutional crisis. Parliament could move to reduce royal funding, strip away our remaining political role, even question the continuation of the monarchy itself." Tom, who had been quiet throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. "What if we hired the best lawyers money can buy? What if we fought the charges? What if we proved Thomas was innocent?" Charles shook his head. "The evidence is too strong, Tom. The palace legal team has reviewed everything. Even if there were extenuating circumstances, even if Thomas was somehow coerced or manipulated, the damage to royal reputation would be severe. The mere association with money laundering, regardless of the outcome, would be used against us for decades." Annabelle, who had been crying quietly throughout the conversation, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. "So what you're saying is that we have to choose between supporting Thomas and maintaining our relationship with you and Camilla?" The stark simplicity of the question forced everyone to confront the reality of what was being proposed. Charles could see the pain in Camilla's eyes as she realized that the choice being demanded would effectively isolate her from everyone she had loved before becoming queen consort. "I'm saying," Charles replied carefully, "that for the immediate future, while legal proceedings are ongoing, it would be best if family members avoided being photographed with us, avoided public statements about royal matters, and maintained a low profile generally." "And if we refuse?" Mark asked bluntly. Charles met his brother-in-law's gaze steadily. "Then, you would be putting us in an impossible position. We couldn't include you in family gatherings, royal events, or any public appearances. Effectively, the result would be the same." The manipulation inherent in the statement wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Charles was offering them a choice, but it was a choice between voluntary exile and forced exile. Either way, the family that had been built over decades of shared experiences and mutual support would be shattered. Laura stood up slowly, her face a mask of controlled fury. "This is exactly why I never wanted to be part of this world," she said quietly. "This is why I've always tried to keep my distance from royal life. Because when push comes to shove, none of us really matter. We're all just supporting actors in the Charles and Camilla show, and when we become inconvenient, we get written out of the script." She moved toward the door, then turned back to face her mother. "I love you, Mom, but I won't abandon my cousin to save your reputation. If that means I can't be part of your royal life anymore, then so be it." As Laura left the room, Tom followed her, stopping only to kiss his mother's cheek and whisper, "I'm sorry, Mom. I can't choose the crown over family." Mark looked at his sister for a long moment, his face showing the pain of a man being forced to choose between his son and his sister. "I hope it's worth it, Camilla," he said finally. "I hope the crown is worth losing everyone who truly loved you before you were queen." With that, he too left the room, followed by Annabelle and Simon, who hugged Camilla briefly before departing without saying anything to Charles. Alone in the dining room, Charles and Camilla faced each other across the table that had hosted so many happy family gatherings. The silence between them was deafening, filled with years of compromises, sacrifices, and the slow erosion of everything that had made their relationship worth fighting for. Are you satisfied? Camilla asked finally, her voice hollow and defeated. Have you successfully protected the monarchy? Charles reached across the table for her hand, but she pulled it away. Camilla, please understand. No, she said firmly. I understand perfectly. I understand that after 40 years, I'm still the woman who has to prove her worthiness to wear your crown. I understand that my family will always be expendable when royal duty calls. And I understand that no matter how much you claim to love me, that love will always come second to your obligations as king. She stood up and walked toward the door, then paused without turning around. Thomas is a foolish young man who made terrible decisions. But he's also my nephew, and he's alone and terrified right now. While you're busy protecting the monarchy from scandal, I'll be trying to figure out how to protect what's left of my family. As the door closed behind her, Charles remained seated at the empty table, surrounded by the remnants of a family gathering that had torn apart relationships built over decades. The crown had protected itself once again, but at a cost that he was only beginning to understand. The palace press office had prepared for many scenarios over the years, but nothing quite compared to the frenzy that erupted when news of Thomas Parker Bowles's arrest broke simultaneously across every major British newspaper and broadcasting network. By 6 o'clock on Thursday evening, the story had exploded from a simple crime report into a full-scale royal crisis that dominated every news cycle across the Commonwealth. Charles stood in the palace's media monitoring room, surrounded by screens showing live coverage from BBC News, Sky News, ITV, and CNN International. The images were relentless. File footage of Thomas at royal events, family photographs from christenings and weddings, telephoto shots of him entering and leaving various luxury hotels and restaurants over the past year. Each news outlet had assembled teams of royal correspondents, financial experts, and legal analysts to dissect every angle of the story. Queen's nephew in £12 million scandal screamed the front page of The Sun, accompanying a photograph of Thomas laughing with Camilla at last year's Chelsea Flower Show. The Daily Mail had gone with royal money laundering shame, while The Guardian's more restrained headline read, Palace faces constitutional questions over family member's arrest. Sir Edward Pemberton stood beside the king, periodically updating him on the latest developments as they came through on his tablet. The BBC is running a special report at 9 o'clock, he informed Charles. They've got constitutional experts discussing the potential implications for royal funding and parliamentary oversight. Charles watched as his communications director, Sarah Morrison, fielded call after call from international media outlets. The story was already being picked up by major networks in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand. Within hours, it would be leading news broadcasts across Europe and making headlines in American newspapers. Where's the Queen Consort? Charles asked, realizing he hadn't seen Camilla since their confrontation that afternoon. In her private apartments, Sir Edward replied. She's asked not to be disturbed and has declined to participate in any crisis management meetings. On the largest screen, royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell was delivering a live report from outside Buckingham Palace, where a growing crowd of reporters and cameramen had gathered. Behind him, protesters had already begun assembling, holding signs reading Royal Accountability Now and Tax Money for Crime. This is far more than a simple criminal matter, Witchell was saying to the camera. This strikes at the heart of questions about royal privilege, about whether family connections to the monarchy provide protection from proper legal scrutiny, and about whether British taxpayers should continue funding an institution that appears unable to police its own extended family. Charles felt a familiar tightness in his chest as he watched decades of careful public relations work crumbling in real time. Every gain the monarchy had made in public approval since his mother's death was being eroded by the hour. Sir, Sarah Morrison approached him, her usually immaculate appearance showing signs of stress. We're receiving requests for interviews from every major network. They want statements from you, from the Queen Consort, from anyone in the family who will comment. What's our current position? Charles asked. Complete silence until we have a clearer picture of the legal proceedings, Sir Edward replied. The Lord Chamberlain believes any premature statement could be used against us later, particularly if Mr. Parker Bowles decides to claim royal connections influenced his business activities. Charles nodded, but he could see the futility of the strategy playing out on every screen around him. Nature abhors a vacuum, and the media was filling the absence of official royal comment with speculation, expert opinion, and increasingly critical analysis of royal finances and privileges. On Sky News, former Conservative MP and longtime royal critic Graham Morrison was explaining to viewers why this scandal was different from previous royal controversies. When we had marital problems, divorce scandals, even the occasional minor legal issue, those were personal matters that didn't directly impact the relationship between the crown and the state, he said. But this involves serious financial crimes that could call into question the entire system of royal funding and oversight. Charles's mobile phone buzzed with a text message from William. Dad, need to talk urgently. This is affecting our foundation work already. Major donors are asking questions. The constitutional implications were already becoming clear. The king's eldest son and heir to the throne was seeing immediate fallout in his own charitable activities. If the scandal continued to grow, it would impact every member of the royal family and every organization associated with them. Sir Edward, Charles said quietly, I want you to arrange a call with the Prime Minister. We need to understand the government's position on this matter. Already arranged, sir. 7:30 this evening. Charles looked around the room at the faces of his staff, people who had dedicated their careers to protecting and promoting the monarchy. They all wore the same expression of controlled concern that he had seen during previous crises, but this felt different. This felt like the beginning of something that could spiral completely out of control. Meanwhile, in her private apartments, Camilla sat in her favorite armchair, staring at her mobile phone as it buzzed continuously with calls and messages from family members, friends, and journalists. She had turned off the television hours ago, unable to watch her nephew's face plastered across every news channel alongside increasingly sensational headlines about royal corruption and constitutional crisis. The messages from her family were particularly painful. Laura had sent several texts expressing her anger and disappointment with the royal response. Tom had called 3 times, but Camilla couldn't bring herself to answer. Mark had left a voicemail that simply said, "Call me when you remember you had a family before you had a crown." She thought about Thomas, alone in a police cell somewhere, probably terrified and confused about how his world had collapsed so completely in such a short time. Whatever mistakes he had made, whatever crimes he had committed, he was still the little boy who had sat on her lap during Christmas dinners, who had been so excited when she married Charles because it meant he was kind of related to the king. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see one of her ladies-in-waiting. Instead, Princess entered the room, her no-nonsense expression softened by genuine sympathy. "I thought you might like some company," and said simply, settling into the chair across from Camilla without waiting for an invitation. "I'm surprised Charles hasn't forbidden you from associating with me," Camilla said bitterly. "Wouldn't want the scandal to spread to the hardest-working member of the royal family," and studied her sister-in-law carefully. "Charles is doing what he thinks is best for the institution. That doesn't mean he's right, and it certainly doesn't mean I have to agree with him. Everyone's abandoning ship," Camilla said, her voice cracking with emotion. "My family thinks I've chosen the crown over them. Charles thinks I'm being unreasonably emotional about necessary decisions. And the press is painting me as either complicit in Thomas's crimes or naive enough to be used by criminals. The press will say whatever sells newspapers," and replied pragmatically. "They've been doing it to this family for decades. What matters is what you believe is right." Camilla looked up at him, surprised by the unexpected support, and had never been particularly warm toward her, maintaining the polite distance that characterized most of her relationships within the family. "What I believe is right is supporting Thomas," Camilla said firmly. "He made terrible mistakes, but he's family. He's scared and alone, and instead of helping him, we're treating him like a contagious disease." And nodded slowly. "I've been thinking about that, about what family actually means when you're royal. We're supposed to be this symbol of stability and tradition, but what kind of tradition abandons its own members when they need help the most?" "Charles would say it's about protecting something larger than any individual," Camilla replied. "About duty to the nation and the institution. Charles has always been very good at convincing himself that what's convenient for him is actually noble duty," and said with characteristic bluntness. He did the same thing when he was married to Diana. Every selfish decision became a matter of royal necessity. The comment stung because it touched on something Camilla had always suspected but never allowed herself to fully acknowledge. How many of Charles's decisions over the years had been genuinely about duty, and how many had been about avoiding difficult conversations or uncomfortable choices? Back in the media monitoring room, Charles was watching the 9 o'clock BBC special report with growing alarm. Constitutional expert Professor Margaret Whitfield was explaining to millions of viewers why this scandal could trigger unprecedented parliamentary oversight of royal finances. The sovereign grant system is based on public trust, Professor Whitfield was saying. If there's any suggestion that royal connections are being used to facilitate criminal activity, Parliament will be under enormous pressure to implement much stricter oversight mechanisms. We could see demands for annual audits of all royal spending, restrictions on which family members can attend official functions, even questions about whether we need such an extensive royal family at all. The implications were staggering. Charles had spent years carefully managing relationships with Parliament, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed the monarchy to retain its constitutional role while adapting to modern democratic expectations. A single scandal involving a distant family member could undo decades of careful diplomacy. His phone rang. The Prime Minister. "Your Majesty," came the familiar voice of Rebecca Thompson, the Labour Prime Minister who had already shown little enthusiasm for royal tradition. "I'm sure you're aware of the developing situation. We need to discuss how the government should respond to parliamentary questions about royal accountability." Charles moved to his private office, away from the monitoring screens and the constant chatter of crisis management. "Prime Minister, I want to assure you that the royal family had absolutely no knowledge of Mr. Parker Bowles' alleged activities. I believe you, but perception is reality in politics," Thompson replied. "I'm already getting pressure from my own backbenchers to call for a comprehensive review of royal funding mechanisms. The opposition is going to have a field day with this. They'll demand investigations, committee hearings, the works. What are you suggesting? Complete transparency, full cooperation with any investigations, and, probably most importantly, visible distance between the royal family and anyone connected to this scandal. No half measures, no subtle responses. The public needs to see that you take this as seriously as they do." Charles closed his eyes, feeling the weight of inevitability settling around him. That would mean effectively cutting off the Queen Consort's family. "I'm afraid it might," Thompson acknowledged. "But the alternative could be much worse. If we can't control this narrative quickly, you could be looking at serious challenges to royal funding, possibly even constitutional reform discussions." After the call ended, Charles sat alone in his office, staring at a portrait of his mother that hung above his fireplace. She had navigated countless scandals and crises throughout her 70-year reign, always finding ways to preserve the monarchy while adapting to changing times. But she had never faced anything quite like this, a scandal that struck at the fundamental relationship between the crown and the British people's trust. He thought about Camilla, alone in her apartments, probably crying over the destruction of relationships that had sustained her through decades of public scrutiny. He thought about Thomas, a young man whose poor decisions were now threatening to bring down an institution that had survived world wars, economic collapses, and social revolutions. Most of all, he thought about the choice that was becoming increasingly clear: save the monarchy or save his marriage. After everything they had endured together, after all the years of waiting and fighting for their right to be together, he was being forced once again to choose between the woman he loved and the crown he had inherited. The media storm raging outside the palace walls showed no signs of abating. If anything, it was growing stronger with each passing hour, fed by speculation, constitutional debate, and the endless appetite of 24-hour news cycles. Tomorrow would bring more pressure, more demands for royal accountability, and more impossible choices. Charles had always known that wearing the crown meant making sacrifices, but he had never imagined that the greatest sacrifice might be the very relationship that had given his life meaning for the past 4 decades. The emergency meeting of the Privy Council had been called for 9 o'clock on Friday morning, but Charles had been awake since 4, pacing the corridors of Windsor Castle as dawn broke over the Thames Valley. The overnight polling results had been devastating. Royal approval ratings had dropped 15 points in just 2 days, with particularly sharp declines among younger voters and those in Scotland and Wales. Lord Chamberlain Pembroke had arrived early, carrying briefing papers that outlined the constitutional crisis in stark, unforgiving detail. The leader of the opposition had tabled a motion in Parliament calling for a full investigation into royal finances and connections. 3 Commonwealth nations had issued statements expressing concern about the scandal's impact on the monarchy's role as head of state. Most damaging of all, several major corporations had announced they were reviewing their partnerships with royal charities and patronages. The situation has moved beyond damage control. Lord Pembroke informed Charles as they walked through the historic corridors where centuries of monarchs had faced their own moments of crisis. We're now talking about institutional survival. Charles stopped beside a window that looked out over the round tower, where the royal standard flew at full mast in the morning breeze. The sight of the flag, symbol of 1,000 years of monarchy, reminded him of the weight of history resting on his shoulders. What exactly are Parliament's powers in a situation like this? Charles asked. Theoretically, quite extensive, Lord Pembroke replied. They control royal funding through the sovereign grant. They can demand accountability measures, impose oversight requirements, even restructure the entire system of royal finance. In extreme circumstances, they could question the constitutional role of the monarchy itself. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Charles had always understood that the monarchy existed at the pleasure of Parliament and the people, but it had been centuries since that reality had been so starkly apparent. And Thomas's legal situation? Getting worse. His lawyers are suggesting he might cooperate with authorities, which could mean revealing details about his business relationships, including any family connections he may have exploited. Charles felt a chill run through him. If Thomas began talking about royal family gatherings, private conversations, or any suggestion that his connection to Camilla had been used to gain credibility with potential criminal partners, the scandal would explode into something far more serious than financial impropriety. In another part of the castle, Camilla was having her own meeting with her private secretary, Angela Richardson, who had been fielding increasingly desperate calls from family members since the story broke. The pressure was beginning to show on everyone connected to the royal household. Your daughter called again this morning, Angela informed Camilla gently. She's very upset about the family being excluded from this weekend's engagement at the Royal Opera House. The Opera House engagement was supposed to be a celebration of Camilla's patronage of the Royal Ballet, an event she had been looking forward to for months. Now it had become another casualty of the crisis, with palace protocol dictating that no family members could be photographed with her at public events. What did you tell her? Camilla asked. That security concerns required limiting the guest list, Angela replied diplomatically. Camilla laughed bitterly. Security concerns. Is that what we're calling it now? She stood up and moved to the window, watching the morning activity in the courtyard below. Angela, in your professional opinion, how long can this go on? Angela hesitated before answering. The legal proceedings could take years, ma'am. If Mr. Parker Bowles pleads not guilty and the case goes to trial, we could be looking at 18 months to 2 years of ongoing media coverage and political pressure. 2 years of isolation from her family. 2 years of seeing her children and grandchildren excluded from her royal life. 2 years of pretending that the people who had supported her through decades of public scrutiny simply didn't exist. There has to be another way, Camilla said quietly. Ma'am, there has to be a way to support Thomas without destroying everything else. He's just a young man who made terrible mistakes. Surely the institution of monarchy is strong enough to survive one family member's poor judgment. Angela looked uncomfortable. The Lord Chamberlain believes the risk is too great. Any appearance of royal protection or influence could trigger parliamentary action that might fundamentally alter the monarchy's role. Camilla turned from the window, her face set with a determination that Angela had rarely seen. Give me a meeting with Thomas's lawyers. I want to understand exactly what he's facing and what options he has. Ma'am, I'm not sure the palace would approve. I'm not asking the palace for permission, Camilla said firmly. I'm asking you to arrange a meeting. This afternoon, if possible. Meanwhile, Charles was enduring the most difficult Privy Council meeting of his reign. The assembled advisors, constitutional experts, and government representatives painted a picture of institutional crisis that grew more serious with each passing hour. The Scottish Parliament has called for a review of the monarchy's role in Scottish governance, reported the Lord President of the Council. There's growing sentiment that this scandal provides an opportunity to reassess constitutional arrangements. The situation in Australia is particularly concerning, added the Commonwealth Secretary. Prime Minister Williams is facing pressure from Republicans who see this as validation of their arguments against constitutional monarchy. Charles listened to each report with growing despair. A single family member's criminal behavior was threatening to unravel constitutional arrangements that had evolved over centuries. The careful balance between tradition and modernization that his mother had maintained throughout her reign was crumbling in real time. What are our options? He asked finally. Complete separation from anyone connected to the scandal, Lord Pembroke replied without hesitation. A clear, unambiguous statement that the royal family disavows Mr. Parker Bowles and his actions, followed by visible exclusion of related family members from all royal activities. For how long? Indefinitely, until public confidence is restored and the constitutional questions are resolved. The word indefinitely hit Charles like a physical blow. He was being asked to abandon Camilla's family not just temporarily, but potentially forever. The woman he had fought so hard to marry would be forced to choose between her husband and her children, between her royal duties and her role as a mother and grandmother. There is one other option, Lord Pembroke continued carefully. The Queen Consort could issue her own statement distancing herself from her nephew's actions and committing to full cooperation with authorities. If she were seen as taking the lead on accountability measures, it might help contain the political damage. Charles understood the implication. Camilla would have to publicly denounce her own nephew, effectively throwing him to the wolves to protect the monarchy. It would be a betrayal that would haunt her for the rest of her life, but it might be enough to satisfy public and parliamentary demands for royal accountability. That afternoon, Camilla met with Thomas's legal team at a discreet law office in central London. The meeting had been arranged without palace knowledge, and she had traveled in an unmarked car with minimal security to avoid media attention. Thomas's lead counsel, Sarah Mitchell QC, painted a stark picture of her client's legal prospects. "The evidence is overwhelming," she explained. "Bank records, email trails, witness testimony from co-conspirators who are cooperating with authorities in exchange for reduced sentences." "What are his options?" Camilla asked. "Realistically, plea bargaining. If he cooperates fully with the investigation and provides information about other individuals involved in the money laundering network, he might receive a reduced sentence." "How reduced?" "Instead of 15 to 20 years, possibly 8 to 10. But cooperation would mean revealing everything about his business relationships, including any connections to prominent individuals or organizations that might have provided credibility or access." Camilla felt sick. Thomas's cooperation with authorities would inevitably involve discussions of his family connections and any occasions where he had leveraged his relationship to Camilla for business purposes. Every family gathering, every royal event where he had been photographed, every introduction he had made using his connection to the royal family, all of it would become part of the public record. "Is there any way to limit the scope of his cooperation?" she asked. "Any way to keep family matters private?" Sarah Mitchell shook her head. "I'm afraid not. The prosecution is specifically interested in how he gained access to potential criminal partners and built credibility for his schemes. His royal connections are central to their case theory." Camilla left the meeting understanding that Thomas's legal situation was hopeless, but, more importantly, that his cooperation with authorities would inevitably drag the royal family deeper into the scandal. Every detail of their private family life would be dissected in court proceedings and splashed across newspaper headlines. That evening, Charles found Camilla in her private sitting room, staring at family photographs that covered a small side table. Pictures of Christmas gatherings, weddings, christenings, decades of memories that now felt like evidence in a criminal investigation. "We need to talk," he said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. "I know what you're going to say," Camilla replied without looking up. "The Privy Council wants me to issue a statement denouncing Thomas and promising full cooperation with authorities. It might be the only way to contain this situation." Camilla finally looked at him, and Charles saw exhaustion in her eyes that went beyond simple fatigue. "Do you remember what you said to me after Diana died? When the whole world was blaming you for her death and demanding that you abdicate?" Charles nodded, remembering those dark weeks when his future as king had seemed impossible. "You said that sometimes the only thing that matters is knowing that the people who love you will stand by you no matter what the world thinks. You said that family loyalty was the only thing that could sustain someone through public hatred and impossible circumstances. This is different, Camilla." "How is it different?" she demanded. "Thomas made terrible mistakes, but he's 28 years old and he's terrified. He needs family support now more than he's ever needed it in his life. And instead of standing by him, you want me to publicly abandon him to save our reputations." Charles leaned forward, taking her hands in his. "I want to support him. I want to support all of you. But I also have responsibilities that go beyond our personal feelings." "You always have responsibilities that go beyond our personal feelings," Camilla said bitterly. "That's been the story of our entire relationship. Every time I've needed you to choose me, to choose us, to choose family over duty, you found a way to convince yourself that sacrificing our happiness serves some greater good." The accusation hit him hard because it contained more truth than he wanted to acknowledge. How many times had he asked Camilla to be patient, to understand, to sacrifice her own needs for royal necessity? "What are you saying?" he asked. Camilla stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the gardens where they had walked together through so many crises over the years. "I'm saying that maybe it's time I stop pretending that being queen consort means anything if it requires me to abandon everyone I loved before I wore this title." Charles felt something cold settling in his chest. "You're talking about leaving. I'm talking about remembering who I was before I became your wife. I was a mother, a sister, an aunt. I was someone who protected her family and stood by them when they needed help. Being queen consort was supposed to add to that identity, not replace it. And if you refuse to distance yourself from Thomas? If you refuse to issue the statement?" Camilla turned to face him, her expression calm but resolute. "Then, I'll face whatever consequences come from putting family before crown. Just like you've always done the opposite." The words hung between them like a chasm that seemed impossible to bridge. After 40 years together, after surviving every scandal and crisis the world could throw at them, they were finally facing a choice that might destroy their marriage forever. Outside, the media siege continued, and tomorrow would bring more pressure, more impossible demands, and more choices between love and duty. But in that moment, in the growing darkness of a Windsor evening, Charles realized that he might be about to lose the only thing that had ever made wearing the crown worthwhile. Saturday morning dawned gray and overcast, matching the somber mood that had settled over Windsor Castle. Charles had spent most of the night in his study, staring at legal documents and constitutional precedents that all pointed toward the same inevitable conclusion. The monarchy's survival required sacrifices that seemed to grow more painful with each passing hour. At 10 o'clock, he was scheduled to meet with the Attorney General and the Lord Chancellor to discuss the legal implications of Thomas's potential cooperation with authorities. But first, he needed to have one final conversation with Camilla, a conversation that would determine not just the future of their marriage, but the direction of his reign. He found her in the morning room, dressed simply in a navy dress and pearls, looking every inch the queen consort except for the red-rimmed eyes that revealed a sleepless night of tears and soul-searching. She was reading letters from members of the public, something she did religiously despite her private secretary's attempts to shield her from the more critical correspondence. "How bad are they?" Charles asked, nodding toward the stack of letters. "Mixed," Camilla replied without looking up. "Some people understand that family loyalty matters more than political convenience. Others think I should be stripped of my titles for being related to a criminal." Charles sat down beside her, studying her profile as she continued reading. Even after all these years, even in the midst of their worst crisis, she remained beautiful to him. More than that, she remained the person who had made his life worth living through decades of public scrutiny and personal turmoil. "The Attorney General believes Thomas will accept a plea agreement within the next 48 hours, Charles said quietly. "Which means he'll start cooperating with authorities early next week." Camilla set down the letter she was reading and looked at him directly for the first time that morning. "And you want me to get ahead of that by issuing a statement disavowing him? I want to find a way through this that preserves both our marriage and the monarchy." "You can't have both, Charles. That's what you've never understood about being king. Every important choice requires sacrificing something precious. You can save the institution or you can save us, but you can't do both." Charles felt the truth of her words like a physical blow. Throughout his life, he had convinced himself that compromise and careful diplomacy could find middle ground in any crisis. But some choices were simply binary, and this was one of them. "If you refuse to distance yourself from Thomas," he said slowly, "Parliament will demand my abdication. They'll say I'm unfit to rule because I can't control my own family's criminal behavior. And if I abandon my nephew to save your crown, our marriage will never recover. I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that when my family needed me most, I chose royal duty over maternal loyalty." They sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding that they had reached the point where words were no longer adequate. 40 years of shared history, of fighting the world for their right to be together, of building a love that had survived impossible obstacles. All of it had led to this moment where they had to choose between each other and everything they had built together. "There's something else," Camilla said finally. "Something you need to know before you make your decision." Charles looked at her questioningly. "I went to see Thomas's lawyers yesterday." The admission hit him like a thunderbolt. "You did what?" "I needed to understand exactly what he's facing, what his options are. I needed to know if there was any way to help him that wouldn't destroy everything else." Charles stood up abruptly, his composure finally cracking. Do you have any idea what you've done? If the press finds out that you secretly met with the lawyers of an accused money launderer, it will look like you're trying to influence the legal proceedings. It will be seen as royal interference in the justice system. I don't care how it looks, Camilla said firmly. He's my nephew. He's family. And he's terrified and alone. You could have triggered a constitutional crisis. We're already in a constitutional crisis. Camilla shot back, standing to face him. What I did was act like a human being instead of a royal robot programmed to sacrifice everyone I love for political convenience. Charles began pacing, his mind racing through the implications of Camilla's secret meeting. If it became public knowledge, it would add fuel to every Republican argument about royal privilege and interference. The government would be under enormous pressure to take unprecedented action against the monarchy. What did you learn? He asked finally. That Thomas is going to cooperate with authorities whether we abandon him or not. That he's going to reveal every detail about his family connections and royal access. That our choice isn't about protecting the monarchy from scandal. It's about whether we're going to support a young man who made terrible mistakes or abandon him to face the consequences alone. Charles stopped pacing and looked at his wife, seeing something in her expression that he recognized from their early years together. It was the same determination she had shown when the world was against their relationship, the same fierce loyalty that had sustained her through decades of public hatred and criticism. The palace lawyers think that if you issue a strong statement distancing yourself from Thomas and committing to full transparency, we can weather this crisis, he said quietly. And what do you think? Charles was quiet for a long moment, considering not just the political implications, but the personal cost of what was being asked. I think that if you issue that statement, you'll never forgive yourself. And I think that if I ask you to issue it, you'll never forgive me. So what are you going to do? Before Charles could answer, Sir Edward Pemberton entered the room with the urgent expression that had become all too familiar over the past week. Your Majesty, I'm afraid we have a new development. Mr. Parker Bowles's lawyers have contacted the press. They're suggesting that their client was encouraged in his criminal activities by family members who provided him with access to wealthy potential investors at royal events. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Thomas wasn't just going to cooperate with authorities. He was going to claim that his royal connections had enabled his criminal activity. Whether true or not, the allegation would dominate headlines for months and provide ammunition for every critic of the monarchy. How long before this becomes public? Charles asked. The Sunday papers are already preparing their coverage, Sir Edward replied. We're looking at front-page stories alleging royal complicity in money laundering. Camilla sank back into her chair, the weight of the crisis finally overwhelming her. He's going to destroy us all to save himself. Charles felt something shift inside him as he watched his wife struggle with the realization that the nephew she was trying to protect was preparing to betray her in the most public way possible. The choice he had been agonizing over was being made for him by forces beyond his control. Sir Edward, he said quietly, prepare a statement for immediate release. The royal family categorically denies any knowledge of or involvement in Mr. Parker Bowles's alleged criminal activities. We will cooperate fully with any investigation and will maintain complete separation from Mr. Parker Bowles and his legal proceedings. Charles, no, Camilla whispered. It's too late, Charles replied, his voice heavy with resignation. He's already chosen his path. He's going to claim we enabled his crimes to reduce his own sentence. We can't protect someone who's preparing to destroy us. Sir Edward nodded and left the room, leaving Charles and Camilla alone with the wreckage of their family relationships. Everything they had tried to preserve was crumbling anyway, but now they were being forced to actively participate in its destruction. What about my children? Camilla asked. What about Laura and Tom? They haven't done anything wrong. They'll have to distance themselves from Thomas as well, Charles said. Anyone who continues to support him publicly will be seen as opposing the royal family's position. Camilla looked at him with an expression of profound sadness. You're asking me to choose between you and everyone I love. After 40 years, you're still asking me to prove my loyalty by sacrificing everyone else. I'm asking you to help me save what we can save. And I'm telling you that if we abandon my children to protect your crown, we'll have saved nothing worth keeping. They stared at each other across the room, both understanding that they had reached the end of something that had once seemed unbreakable. The love that had survived royal protocol, public hatred, and decades of obstacles was finally being destroyed by the weight of choices that had no good options. What are you going to do? Charles asked. Camilla walked to the window and looked out at the gardens where they had walked together through so many crises. When she turned back to face him, her expression was calm, but resolute. "I'm going to be a mother," she said simply. "I'm going to support my children, even if it means they can't be part of your royal world. I'm going to visit my nephew in prison, even if it means I can't represent the crown at public events. I'm going to be the person I was before I married you, because that person knew how to love without conditions." "And us?" Charles asked, though he already knew the answer. "There is no us if us requires abandoning everyone else," Camilla replied. "I've learned that lesson too many times, Charles. I won't learn it again." She walked toward the door, then paused and turned back to him one final time. "I love you. I've loved you for 40 years, through everything the world could throw at us. But I won't sacrifice my children for your crown. Not anymore." As the door closed behind her, Charles stood alone in the morning room, surrounded by the symbols of a monarchy that would survive this crisis, but at a cost that made survival feel like defeat. The institution he had fought so hard to protect had finally demanded a price too high to pay. Outside, the media siege continued, and within hours the story would take its final, devastating turn. But inside Windsor Castle, in the silence of a room where a marriage had just ended, King Charles III faced the bitter truth that sometimes winning meant losing everything that mattered. The crown remained secure on his head, but the woman who had made wearing it worthwhile was walking away forever, choosing love over loyalty to an institution that demanded everything and gave back only the hollow satisfaction of duty fulfilled. 3 days later, as Thomas Parker Bowles was led into court to formally enter his plea, Camilla sat in the public gallery with her children, watching her nephew face the consequences of his actions surrounded by family who refused to abandon him. The photographs of the Queen Consort supporting an accused criminal would dominate headlines for weeks and trigger the constitutional crisis that Charles had fought so hard to avoid. But as she held her daughter's hand and watched her nephew struggle to maintain his composure, Camilla knew she had finally made the right choice. After 40 years of putting royal duty before maternal loyalty, she had remembered who she was before she wore a crown. The price would be everything she had built with Charles, but some things were worth more than keeping a marriage that required abandoning everyone else she loved. In the end, she had chosen to be human rather than royal, and for the first time in decades, that choice brought her peace.